Welcome to this deep dive. We're here to unpack complex information and pull out the really crucial insights for you.
That's the plan.
Today, we're tackling the global market for respiratory monitoring devices. We're looking at a report from Cognitive Market Research. It's their Global Respiratory Monitoring Devices Market Report 2025.
Right. And it puts the market size at, let's see, USD 27,480 million in 2025. So pretty substantial already.
Exactly. And our aim today is just to get a clear picture of the key trends, what it all means, without getting lost in absolutely every single number.
Absolutely. And I think the headline finding really is just how much growth is expected in this sector over the next few years. It really jumps out.
Okay, so let's dig into that growth then. We know the starting point, the 27.48 billion USD. Where's it heading?
Well, the projection sees it climbing quite significantly from that figure in 2025 up to nearly 51.6 billion USD by 2033.
Wow, okay. That's almost double.
It is. And that works out to a compound annual growth rate, a CAGR, of 8.20% between 2025 and 2033.
8.2%?
Yeah.
Okay. That's a solid rate of growth year on year. What's really pushing this expansion?
The main driver, according to the report, is the rising number of people worldwide dealing with respiratory conditions.
Things like COPD, asthma.
Exactly. COPD, asthma, cystic fibrosis. They're becoming more common, unfortunately, and good monitoring is just vital for managing these conditions effectively.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So let's break it down geographically. Where are the hotspots for this market right now? Which regions are the big players?
North America is definitely the leader at the moment. It holds the largest share, over 40% of the global market projected for 2025.
Over 40%.
Yeah, which translates to about 10.17 billion US dollars. Their growth rate is pegged at 6.7% annually.
Okay. And within North America, any specific countries driving that?
The US is the powerhouse, no surprise there. Estimated at just over $8 billion in 2025, growing at 6.5%. And a key trend in the US is this growing focus on managing respiratory care at home.
Okay. Home-based care.
Exactly. Then you have Canada, around 1.2 billion, but with a slightly higher growth rate, 7.5%, better infrastructure, maybe more awareness cited there.
Right.
And Mexico's around 925 million, growing at 7.2%.
So overall for North America, it's advanced healthcare, focus on respiratory health. Sounds about right.
Yeah, and things like R&D, partnerships, trying to bring costs down too. It's a mix of factors.
Okay. So North America is the current heavyweight. How does Europe compare?
Europe's also very significant. It holds over 30% of the global share.
Right.
Market size, just under 8 billion USD in 2025, and their projected growth is 7.2% annually, so slightly higher than North America's overall rate.
Interesting. Are there standout countries within Europe?
Well, the UK market is estimated at about 1.3 billion, and it actually has a pretty robust growth rate forecast at 8%.
8%, okay.
Yeah, linked to their established healthcare system, knowledgeable patients, and also the aging population factor. Germany's market is actually larger, about 1.5, nearly 1.6 billion. Growth there is 7.4%, and the report suggests it's driven by high awareness of the advanced devices available.
I see.
Then you've got France, Italy, Russia, Spain. They're all significant pieces of the puzzle, each with slightly different growth figures, mostly in the 6–7% range.
So for Europe, it sounds like strong health systems, maybe stricter regulations, and similar drivers like rising conditions in aging populations.
That's pretty much it, plus maybe environmental factors and a focus on early detection and personalized treatment.
Okay. Now let's shift to the Asia-Pacific region, APAC. You often hear about high growth there. Does that hold true here?
Oh, absolutely. APAC currently has about 23% of the market share, so around 6.6 billion USD for 2025.
Okay, so smaller than North America and Europe right now.
For now, yes. But here's the key thing. The projected CAGR is 11%.
11%, wow.
Yeah, easily the highest growth rate of any major region.
That's really significant. What's fueling that boom in APAC?
Well, China's a massive part of it. Their market is around 2.8 billion, growing at 10.5%. Largely due to rising respiratory diseases. But look at India. Its market is smaller, maybe 660 million now, but the projected growth is almost 13%.
12.9%, highest in the region. Incredible.
It really is. Japan and South Korea also have, substantial markets and strong growth rates, around 9.5 to 10%. South Korea benefits from favorable medical programs, apparently.
So what are the general themes driving this across APAC?
It seems to be a combination of factors, things like rapidly improving healthcare infrastructure, rising healthcare spending generally,
Right.
growing awareness about respiratory health, quicker adoption of medical tech, especially in emerging economies, and then, urbanization, pollution, and just the sheer size of the population in many areas.
Okay, so definitely the region to watch for future expansion, even if North America and Europe lead today.
Yeah.
What about the other regions? South America, Middle East, Africa. Are they significant factors?
They're smaller shares, but still growing. South America has just over 5% of the market. That's about 1 billion USD in 2025, growing at a strong 8.9%.
Almost 9%.
Not bad at all. No. Brazil's the largest there. Argentina's growing fast too, linked to home care again. The drivers seem to be better access to healthcare developing, adopting diagnostic tech.
Okay. And the Middle East?
Around 2% market share, so about 1.1 billion USD, but growing quite fast at 9.5%.
Faster than South America even.
Yeah, Saudi Arabia is the biggest market, but Turkey and the UAE also have high growth rates, around 10%. Lots of investment in healthcare infrastructure, particularly in the GCC countries, and high rates of respiratory issues are factors there.
In Africa?
Africa holds about 1% of the global market currently, maybe 605 million USD, growing at 8.5%.
So decent growth.
Yes, considering the challenges. South Africa is the largest market. Nigeria is mentioned for awareness of advanced devices. The drivers are more about initiatives to increase access, tackling respiratory infections, improving infrastructure where possible.
It really highlights how varied the global picture is, depending on local conditions and investment levels. Fascinating.
Definitely.
Okay, let's pivot now from regions to the actual products. What kinds of devices are we talking about in this market?
The report breaks it down into several categories. You've got your pulse oximeters.
Right, the little finger clip things.
Exactly, measuring oxygen saturation. Then capnographs, which monitor CO2 levels. Spirometers for lung function tests.
Uh-huh.
Polysomnographs, or PSG devices, they're mostly for sleep studies. Peak flow meters, measuring how fast you can exhale. Gas analyzers, and then an others category.
Okay, quite a range. Is there one segment that's really dominating the market?
Pulse oximeters are definitely the largest segment right now.
Makes sense, especially post-COVID.
Exactly. Their use just surged. They're non-invasive, pretty effective for tracking oxygen and heart rate. And the potential for connecting them to smartphones makes them really accessible.
Right. But you mentioned something interesting earlier, the fastest growing segment.
Yes. That, according to this report, is peak flow meters.
Peak flow meters. Okay. Why the rapid growth there? They seem simpler.
I think that's part of the appeal. The report highlights their portability, the fact they can be used for remote monitoring, they're easy to handle, and they're used for diagnosing and tracking conditions like asthma, obviously, but also mentioned in relation to lung cancer monitoring. With those conditions on the rise, the demand for something convenient like a peak flow meter is apparently growing very fast.
Interesting dynamic. The biggest segment isn't necessarily the fastest growing one.
Quite common in tech markets, actually.
True. Okay, so we know the regions, we know the main products. Who's actually using these devices? Where are they being deployed?
The main end user segments listed are home care, hospitals, ambulatory surgical centers, and specialty clinics.
And which of those holds the biggest share currently?
Hospitals are still the largest segment by far.
Okay.
Which makes sense given the sheer number of hospitals worldwide and the ongoing investment in hospital infrastructure and equipment.
The traditional core of healthcare.
Yeah.
But you mentioned home care earlier.
Yeah.
Is that catching up?
It's definitely expanding rapidly. That home care segment is showing very strong growth.
And why is that?
Several reasons cited. Rising healthcare costs generally push people towards alternatives. The increasing availability of actual home healthcare services and devices, the aging population who often prefer care at home if possible, and just, a general desire for more convenient options.
Right. Ties back nicely to the growth in portable things like pulse oximeters and peak flow meters.
Exactly. It all fits together.
Okay, before we wrap this up, the report briefly mentioned some overarching factors. Can you give us a quick sense of the main market drivers, any potential roadblocks, and maybe key trends to watch?
Sure. So key drivers we've touched on: the growing elderly population, the rise in respiratory conditions, pollution levels,
Right.
and also increased government healthcare spending, especially noted in emerging economies.
And the brakes. What could slow things down?
The main restraints mentioned are the cost of some of these devices, which can be quite high,
Yeah.
and some technical issues or limitations with certain devices, accuracy, connectivity, things like that.
Okay. And trends? Anything emerging?
Well, somewhat worryingly, increasing tobacco use is mentioned as a factor influencing respiratory health, alongside changing consumer lifestyles.
Hmm,
But on the tech side, the big trend is the integration with other technologies, particularly smartphones and apps for data tracking and sharing.
makes sense. More connected health. And what about the companies themselves? Is it like dominated by a few giants?
The report describes it as mildly fragmented. So yes, there are big players, but also quite a lot of smaller local companies in the mix.
Okay.
And the strategies seem pretty standard for this kind of market. Partnerships, acquisitions, mergers to gain share.
M&A activity.
Yeah. And a big focus on R&D, developing new products, adding features, trying to compete on price as well.
Any specific examples?
They mentioned a couple of recent ones, like the FDA approving a contactless sleep monitoring device called Sleep is One Plus back in July 2022.
Contactless. Interesting.
Yeah. And another example was Senzyme AB acquiring a company called Respiratory Motion in June 2022, specifically to broaden their product line in this area. Shows active consolidation.
Okay, great context. So let's try and pull this all together now. If someone's listening, what are the absolute key takeaways from this deep dive into the respiratory monitoring device market?
I'd say, first, it's a market clearly set for significant growth globally. Second, while North America and Europe are the biggest markets now, the fastest growth by far is projected for the Asia-Pacific region. Watch that space.
Right. APAC growth leader.
Third, product-wise, pulse oximeters have the largest share currently, likely boosted by the pandemic, but peak flow meters are identified as the segment with the highest growth potential.
The fast mover.
Exactly. And fourth, this growth is fundamentally driven by the rising tide of respiratory illnesses worldwide, coupled with technological advances making monitoring easier and more accessible, especially this shift towards more home-based care.
Okay, that's a great summary. So for our listeners, this really points towards a future where we might have more tools, potentially more sophisticated, more accessible tools to manage our own respiratory health.
Definitely.
And it signals a continued evolution in how healthcare is delivered, moving beyond just the hospital walls with a bigger societal focus maybe on respiratory wellness overall.
Absolutely. And, it leaves you wondering, given all this rapid change, the technological advancements, these different regional growth speeds,
Yeah.
what kind of new innovations or maybe completely new applications might we see next in respiratory and monitoring?
And what's the next leap?
Exactly. How could those future innovations really change the game for individual health management and maybe even reshape global healthcare strategies? It's certainly a dynamic field with a lot of potential impact ahead.